A medium best enjoyed as a solitary listener using a headphone, your best companion on a long commute, a form more immersive when compared to radio playing in the background. If you are a serious podcast listener, or maybe you've just discovered it recently, this episode is for you. Hello, and welcome to the sixth episode of Remediate with Sabir. It's been a while, I know, just keeping up with the new academic year, and I can tell you it feels great to connect with you all. It's been a year since I have started looking into podcasting from an academic point of view. And thanks to my ongoing research, I've met some very talented and very hardworking podcasters in the UAE. Our guest today is someone who, in a way, completes my search for podcasters in the UAE. I'm glad that he and his team is working really hard to ensure that we have the right momentum to keep the UAE podcasting community alive. I'll be connecting with Chirag Desai, founder and CEO of Amaeya Media, as we look into this insights of this resurgence of podcasts globally. And we also will throw light on the UAE podcasting landscape. Let's remediate podcasting. And let's kick off the show by getting Chirag into the call. Let me get him into the call. Hi, Chirag. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Dr. Sabir. How are you?
Pleasure. I think I just, for this particular show, I was least worried about my guests' like settings. And I think maybe you are much more prepared than me when
Well,
it comes to getting ready for a show.
that's always a good sign, right? I think when a guest comes on and they're like, yeah, I've got my mic set up and I've got my headphones on. It's such a relief. It's funny you mentioned this because literally yesterday I put together like a 3-slide deck to send to guests to be like, here, please prepare this way when we do remote recordings because there are so many considerations, Wi-Fi and echoes and room and all that. So yeah, it's always nice when the guest kind of comes prepared.
I know it's a big relief for me. Thank you so much.
No problem at all.
No, it's very interesting because although I have been listening to podcasts for some years now,
yeah.
But I think it was only in the early 2019 when I really got interested in this particular area of research, and there are obviously some few factors into it. I started actually listening to a lot of local podcasts from 2019. Before that, I was listening mostly US based podcasts. So that got me to thinking. How is it in the UAE? Because
I almost want to interrupt you and ask you, like, did you start listening to any of mine in 2019 or not?
Yes.
You did? Okay, cool.
2019 late. 2019 I started actually.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So in the beginning part of 2019, I used to be basically listening to like the Dukan show and the Cunning Cultures, and maybe towards the middle of 2019, I actually started listening to a much broader, much broader, because I
Yeah.
started looking for podcasts. And when I started looking for podcasts and searching for podcasts in the UAE, I found it very difficult to understand, how the landscape is.
Hmm.
And only after I met few of the podcasters, I kind of understood, how the landscape really is. But there's still, as far as data is concerned, it was missing. And only after I got in touch with you, and then through Amaya Media, when you come up with a report, which basically gave a state of the industry report, which
Hmm.
talked about the breadth of the industry and how this industry can monetize itself. That is something which also talks about the sustainability of the medium itself.
Yeah. Hmm.
So it kind of opened my eyes, and I'm really thankful for sharing the report with me at a pretty crucial stage. So my first question to you is, what made you come up with the report? Was it something similar that the concerns that I had, or it came out from a very different place altogether?
No, I think some of the initial motivations were similar to yours, right? So obviously we had been producing, I think, for a couple of years at this point. We also kind of felt the same difference, right? Everything was kind of happening in silos. We didn't really have kind of an ecosystem, if you want to call it that. Yeah, we knew of other podcasters, but then what do we have any kind of baseline for data? Do we have any baselines for just understanding what does this region have? What can we do? What is the listener like here, right? And how different it is. So you made a very important, I mean, very interesting point just now where you said I was listening to a lot of international US based shows. Well, our data threw up the same thing, right? That only 28% of the total people we surveyed actually were listening to local things. And this was something, we had kind of hypothesize because I was obviously in the industry talking to so many people about what their listener patterns were like, and I kept seeing the same pattern, and we said, okay, let's see if we can find data around it. And so then it was like, okay, why is it that there's such a big gap between people wanting to listen? And so there were so many different questions we wanted to explore. You mentioned monetization as one. I mean, we're someone that has been around now. We're touching 3 years, and we have been doing that, right? Like, so we're producing shows for other people, we're looking at branded content, we're looking at sponsorships. These are obviously models that work in places like the US, but here again it's very nascent. And then finally, again, as I mentioned, it was also trying to say, okay, we, as someone who has been doing a lot of work in the podcast space here, how can we start creating collaboration between different people who are in the industry, and what can we do to do that? So the report was kind of, we did some stuff before the report as well, like we did some podcaster collaborations, but this report was meant to be like, let's create a baseline that eventually I hope will be an independent thing that happens among podcasters, and not necessarily an Amaya Media document that gets
Mm,
released.
mm,
But we said,
mm,
let's spearhead this thing to say, let's put let's make it a little bit more quantifiable, and we can talk about why the podcasting industry actually does not lend itself very easily to data in the way it's designed.
mm.
But let's try and do that. So I mean, we spoke to you gave us some insights
Yeah,
as well based on your
yeah,
research. We
yeah,
spoke to other
yeah.
podcasters, we spoke to some hosts, we spoke to hosting providers and things like that, to try and say, okay, what are the different things. And of course we had been studying already similar reports and similar pieces of data that were coming out of places like the US and stuff, and so we wanted to try and juxtapose that to say, okay, here's how the patterns look like in places like the US where the market's really mature. What's the pattern like here? Can we try and quantify it a
Mm,
little bit? And then let's use that as a stepping point to say, okay, now based on this, can we come back next year or the year after that and say, how much has changed and what's happening?
right, right. No, I think I want to go back to the very basics. I mean, when I started listening to podcasts, it's obviously I have some experience of listening to radio,
Mm.
and
Yeah, yeah.
it was quite interesting how as we have evolved in terms of the new media and the digital media. This option of having a podcast was always there. I think when iTunes first came,
Sure.
it
Yeah,
was always there, but it only became very popular in the last few years.
yeah.
How would you see this resurgence of podcast? And do you think that this growth, if I may say, if I may use the word growth, is it sustainable? Do you think that we have things in place today that it looks or it seems to be sustainable, this particular growth?
So I think the answer to that is kind of, there's two parts. One is when you look at things from a medium perspective to say, no, why did a certain medium take off and why did something like that happen? There's a pivotal moment in 2014, which was the advent of a show called Serial, right, in the US, which created this. It was a show that came out that became insanely popular in its first season and was only available as a podcast. So anybody that wanted to consume it had to discover what a podcast was. And if this is, I use this model as to match it to things like House of Cards was for Netflix, let's say, right? Where you have this piece of content or this show that kind of spearheads the medium forward because everybody wants to consume it. And I think that that was one of the big reasons why we saw this huge resurgence in 2014, especially 2014, 2015. One of the first shows to cross million downloads very quickly and so on and so forth. So that was one of the reasons why. The other one is if we take a step back and look at the wider picture, it's also consumption behavior has changed a lot in the last 5 years, right? Today the average consumer is very interested in on-demand content, right? Of course, you look at your models, your Netflix, and you look at everybody's in the streaming business today, right? And the reason for that is because people don't want to consume cable TV. People don't want to be told what to watch and just jump in or find a time. Everybody has to, we used to watch TV shows. Everybody had to show up at 7 p.m. to watch a show. And I want to consume it on my time when I want what I want, right? And so this pattern is another reason I think why podcast is taking off, because podcasts are designed to be on demand compared to when you look at a model like radio, where radio again is similar to cable, where when you tune in, you hear what's being played. And if you don't like it, well, that's tough luck. Whereas with a podcast, it's like I'll decide what I want to watch, what I want to listen to, and when I want to listen to it. And I think these two things have kind of together really created that kind of push.
I think this brings me to the next question, which basically is that because of the popularity of serial, and we see that there are lots of new shows which came, which try to have like a similar kind of an appeal. I think
Yeah.
the appeal was primarily how close a listener feels to a story, a particular
Yeah.
narrative. I think serial had that particular, personal narrative, and
Yeah.
this girl is going on a personal journey. And you see a lot of other shows which, and crime, I think it's a very big
Yes,
in
true
US,
crime is
which is
actually a
very
hugely
popular.
popular category in the US.
Exactly. So my question is, something like, if you talk about really popular shows on radio, like This American Life, for example, you have other popular shows on radio as well, which we find today in podcast as well.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
my question is actually related to genre and the popularity of a particular genre. We have this freewheeling sort of a conversation that happens
Yeah.
between one or two hosts, and I think it seems to be a very very popular genre in podcast. What, according to you, are I'm not you can give me a global and a local perspective as well into the genres of podcast, and what do listeners like to watch and like to listen, if you have any in terms of any data which proves that. Give us some
So we
insights
didn't.
on genre.
Yeah. So this is something we're still looking to explore. One of the reasons why we didn't get so much into the style of the show, we looked at the categories. So when you talk about genre, that also includes kind of the category, right? Crime versus entertainment versus technology and so on. So we did look into that, and we find that here there is a tremendous demand for entertainment and comedy. And this is again, this is all pre-COVID, by the way. I assume that this demand is even higher now. But there's not enough supply of that stuff. In terms of the number of shows that are coming out. When you talk about the genre in terms of style of show, I think there's popularity across multiple genres, right? There are shows that are hugely popular where they are just freewheeling conversations. I mean, look at something like the Joe Rogan podcast, which is even popular like worldwide, where it's essentially him, sitting across with a guest for 2 or 3 hours, or sometimes longer. And a lot of people consume either all of it or parts of it or whatever it is. I listen to quite a few shows like that too on the tech side that go on for 2 hours, and I just listen to them in parts as I want, or I listen to them at 1.5 speed, if the case matters. And then there's the narrative style, which is what serial really propelled to say. I mean, serial kind of showed that like actually there is a demand for, and people will be willing to listen to a narrative kind of content. I mean, in the case of serial, it was like an 8-part series, right? Like they did 8 episodes over the course of a season where they kind of unfolded a story to you. I will preface this by saying that you have to remember as well that the makers of serial, and then again the producing quality that came from This American Life, these were public radio journalists who had been doing this for decades, right? So I mean, if you look at the public radio system in the US, it's extremely mature. I mean, it starts at the collegiate level, goes all the way up, and so on, right? And so you have journalists who've been around for decades who are very, very skilled at their craft, both narrative storytelling, but also investigative journalism, and so on. So I think all of these factors, of course, help serial create the kind of show that they create, and which is why it's also difficult to emulate, right? Because it's not the easiest thing to do, and it takes a lot of years of practice and all that. But I think what serial showed again is that there is an appetite for things like that, and that's why I think it's something we do. I mean, we do a couple of shows that are more narrative than just interview style, and it does work, right? It resonates with a certain type of listener. And so we kind of do multiple kind of shows that work for both. I think both styles have a place in the podcasting space for sure. And I think different listeners prefer different things. I mean, I know people that don't enjoy a narrative format. They're like, I'm very happy to listen to an interview. I don't want the narrative. And I know a lot of people that will turn around and say, I don't like these freewheeling interviews. There's so many of those. Come and tell me a story. And then you have people in between. So I think it is pretty weird. I don't think that there is a very fixed thing to say, like a certain population or certain region prefers one kind or the other. It also depends on the supply of the content, as I said, right? So if there are enough narrative shows, people will listen to them. But we live in a region where we actually don't have that many.
Right. I mean, coming to a number of shows, I think Amaya Media is credited to with so many podcast shows that you guys are producing. Tell us about Amaya Media, and I want to particularly understand how do you help people in basically setting up their show, and what kind of advice do you provide? Because there is content, and obviously there is a form, and
Yeah.
which area do you like to work with, and what is the ecosystem that you are trying to build, something that basically drives you to work every day.
Yeah, look, I mean, I got into podcasts as most people do as a hobby, and I was kind of frustrated with the way we are consuming things, and some of that frustration still continues today. And it was kind of my way of standing up and saying, you know what, I'm going to put out content that I would like to hear, and hopefully other people will like to hear it. That's kind of eventually what evolved into Amaya Media, right? So I started then looking at a lot of local spaces and seeing what was here, realizing there was so much missing in terms of content, in terms of style that we just discussed, but even categories, right? So what we're trying to do, or what we believe, is that there is a real untapped potential here, which is kind of our mission statement as well. And we want to kind of unlock that. And so, how do we go about unlocking that? I mean, obviously, there are many layers to that. But our idea is to say, we want to look at either a piece of content that is really something that could be unique, or we think that we could provide a really valuable spin to it. So we can provide our take on it rather. Then let's delve into it and see what we can do. So as an example, I mean, one of the first shows that I was actually working on, although it came out much later, is a show on entrepreneurs called Tales of the Trade. And it's actually one where it's a narrative-based show around the story of businesses that are local. And it was one of those things where I was like, these are the kind of companies that they have amazing stories, and it's very unique as well, right? Entrepreneurship in this region has a very unique kind of take on it. I mean, in terms of the challenges we face and the opportunities we face and what that's like. And I wanted to be able to tell that story, and that's what I do, right? So I sit down with the entrepreneurs for a couple of hours, we go over everything, and then I tell the story to the listener of what I think that entrepreneur journey was. And so it's stuff like that, right? Like there are tons and tons of shows around entrepreneurs, there are tons of interviews. So this was our way of presenting that show. And so that's kind of what we like to do, right? We like to see how we can help grow the ecosystem by creating more content that listeners might enjoy. We're looking at, when we talk about the monetization piece, we're working very closely with a lot of companies who want to be in the space and figure out how they can be in the space in a way that the content that they create is valuable, because that's, again, really important, right? I mean, there is a space for advertising in podcasts, but when we talk about things like branded content, there's a lot of value and a lot of data around how branded content is actually something that it works really well in podcasting if done well. And so we want to work, and that's what we've been doing, right? We've been working with companies to say, look, we have the expertise in not just the production part of it. Of course, it's a technical thing, but there is expertise required there too. But we have the expertise in creating audio shows, right? In creating and taking the pieces of content and delivering it in an audio format. It can be something as simple as an interview, and something as complicated as a narrative show that can be done over in a seasonal format and so on. And so we'll bring our expertise, we'll take your brand message and figure out a way to create valuable content that's available to the listener. And the idea of doing that is, again, it's part of helping grow that ecosystem, because the ecosystem will grow if there's money here, right? So you mentioned the point about, is this medium sustainable? Well, we have to work towards building that sustainability, right? We need more content creators to come out and create shows. We need more businesses to come out and invest either as shows or in advertising in the medium. And then we need the listeners to also listen in and then do that. And all of these pieces have to work together if this has to become sustainable. So we think that we can play a bit of a role there, because we play in all the three pieces to say we can help creators push their content out there. We can work with companies to help figure out ways in which they can invest here. as well as put their content out there. And then we can look and seeing how we can distribute to more listeners or create content that listeners want to hear, and kind of create that or help push that ecosystem further.
I find it really interesting because in today's world, everybody is a content creator. I mean,
Yes.
because of Facebook and because of the ease of
Sure.
actually basically pushing content. And one of the other things which I also noticed during my research is that you will find a lot of podcast shows being listed, but very few of them are actually active. And I
Correct.
think one of the key factors for keeping this medium alive are people who can take it seriously. Not like, okay, one time thing, and then it's fun for now, and then it basically dies off. And I think there could be different factors for that happening.
Absolutely.
So this
Yeah.
is one factor I realized very early, that there are very few shows which has tested the length of time, and
Mm.
they are still surviving, they're still pushing content out. um, for somebody who is interested, maybe they have a page in Facebook and they have certain content that they produce on a regular basis. I'm talking both individually and also as a brand, for example. What would be your advice if they are looking at this medium like today, and they want to get into it? What would be a good starting point, one? And two, do they need to go through some formal training for to actually start or have a podcast to begin with?
So I'll take it back to what you were just describing about seriousness, right? I think that is actually one of the first things that need to exist. I mean, you mentioned shows not existing. I'll just give you an idea of some stats, right? So today there are almost 1.5 million shows registered in Apple Podcast directory today, right? Out of these, roughly about 45% are actually active, where activeness is defined as they have produced an episode in the last 90 days. Now, there's some variance here. Obviously, some shows are seasonal; they're not producing all the time, but that's quite a telling statistic, right? Or if you look at the other one where you mentioned like they put out a few episodes and they stop, right? Out of these 1.5 million podcasts, less than 40% have gone beyond 10 episodes, right? So this is a very telling stat in terms of saying there's a lot of people trying the medium but not necessarily going the way through. Now, in that light, and going to my piece of advice would be have a plan, and I think that that's super important. So this is not to take away from someone who's, let's say, whose content creation mode is Instagram. Even I think there is a lot of planning and stuff that has to happen there too. But when you're creating longer form content, right, there you need to have the seriousness and the planning to say, look, this is what I'm going to talk about. These are kind of people I'm going to talk about. Or if it's a show between you and a co-host, these are kind of topics we're going to talk about. Do I have enough? Can I plan myself 10, 15, 20 episodes down the road to be able to create something that's valuable? Because you are not going to see results after 2 episodes. You are absolutely not. And then if you're not coming from a space where you are bringing followers from another medium, let's say, right? Let's say you're just starting out fresh. You're doing some stuff on Facebook, but it's not a lot, right? Transferring those users, I mean, or you don't have that base and you're starting from scratch, it's going to take 20, 30 episodes, a couple of years to create content. I mean, you look Gary Vee, who's he's quite the content creator. I mean, he says it very often, right? That it took him 5, 7, 10 years before people started paying attention to him. And he was posting content all the time. Now today he's super regular, but back then he would post, with some frequency. But it took it does take that long, right? And this is true of any, even any business, right? So this was an interesting discussion I was having with one of our partners for whom we create a show on. They just celebrated 20 episodes, and we kind of did a behind the scenes thing. We were talking about micro entrepreneurship, right? Every entrepreneur, every content creator needs to view what they're doing as almost as entrepreneurship, right? You have to think about, what are you going to put out? Like, what's your product? Who's your target audience? How are you going to market? How are you going to distribute? I mean, these are all things you have to think about. And so that, for me, the baseline advice is always have a plan. Start with something. This is not to say that winging it or saying that I've got this idea, I'm just going to go for it, is a bad thing. But you see that in majority of the cases, if you're not sure, if this is a new medium for you, without a plan, you will eventually fizzle it out, because other things will always take priority. Monetizing a podcast, especially in this region today, is very difficult. And so when you mention, a lot of people don't stick around, there's two sides to it, right? You have the seriousness of the people who want to create the content, but if money doesn't come in, and this is what you're looking to, so if you're in the podcast business to raise revenue, it's going to be tough, right? And you will lose heart quickly. But trying to figure out how you can leverage this communication medium as an extension of something you're doing. So when you talk about companies, most of the companies we work with, they look at podcasts as a way of saying this is another channel to either communicate with listeners or to drive our communication strategy. And if you can think of it that way, then you will be in it for the long term because you will drive it for longer. So for me, again, like I said, my baseline advice is always have a plan. Actually, spend some time, think about it. If you're working with co-hosts, spend some time and say, are we going to commit time to this? Are we going to come back, I don't know, every couple of weeks or every month and actually sit and talk about stuff? What kind of stuff are we going to talk about? Because if you don't have this stuff, you'll hit episode 3 or 4 and be like, well, I don't have anything to talk about today. It's fine. I'm not going to record. And then that kind of starts to slide.
I mean, I find this particular region quite interesting, particularly because you have so many different cultures and so many different nationalities. And I think every different nationality, every group of people have a very different taste when it comes to cultural shows. And I think that because of the expat subculture that is here, there's a lot of scope for like so many different content,
Absolutely.
which can actually bring the community together. What is your take when it comes to UA's podcast culture? And I'm talking about the I've often seen that one podcaster supports another podcasters, and it's a very close knit community at the moment.
Sure.
What is your take on that, and how can we improve, the podcasting scene in the UAE by bringing in different kind of shows and maybe focusing more on culture?
Yeah, look, it's a tough question to answer because I don't think we've developed it yet. I think we're still very early in this journey, right? If you ask me, like, what are the kind of shows Amaeya Media produces, I can kind of give you an overview to say, look, these are the kind of shows we're interested in. These are the kind of shows we greenlight, right? But if you look at it from I can do that because again, there's some kind of planning and structure that goes into how there's some curation that we do around our content. But if you look in general, I don't think we've quite developed a culture per se. You see what happens by default, and I think the default is what we were talking about earlier, tends to be an interview show with an entrepreneur or a tastemaker or something, right? That's typically what gets created, partly because it's an easy format to do, partly because we are in a country where I think just about everybody knows at least like 5 entrepreneurs anyway, right? Because entrepreneurship is SMEs is such a big part of our economy that we all
True.
just through our circles or through a few degrees of separation know somebody. And we're like, okay, well, why don't I interview these people and why don't I tell their story? And by the way, I mean, that's how I started too. So I think because of that, this is what we tend to see, but I would like to believe that's not really the culture of what can be created here. And I think as more of us create and experiment with different content, and we do that all the time, right? We're experimenting in different categories. We're looking at what's working in certain categories versus not. We started a documentary show last year, and it's you'll be amazed. I mean, we looked at, I think, overall over the course of the season, maybe 3-4 different cultural targets, right? So some repeated and so on. And what actually happened surprised what we thought was going to happen. Right, so we thought that this episode was going to do really well. It didn't, and we thought this episode was kind of okay. I mean, we don't know; they're not very vocal and so on. And suddenly there was like a big push behind that episode, right? And so we're kind of also learning through that process to say, like, what is the listener here willing to accept in terms of local content, and then how can we keep pushing that? Because again, at the end of the day, we do want to kind of have some say in the content, right? So we're not just going to be like, oh, listeners wants this, therefore let's just keep producing that, because then that would kind of defeat the purpose. We want to be able to tell stories that we think are unheard and not told often. But it has to be delivered in a way that the listener wants to take it, right? Because at the end of the day, we're doing it for them. So I think to answer your question, I don't think we have one yet. We see what is prevalent, but I think we're still developing, right? More and more of us are doing this. And I do hope as well, like as more monetization happens, it'll create, I mean, when you look at someone who has creative ideas and stuff, right? There might be other compulsions why he may not explore a podcast, right? He needs the job, he needs, and so on. And I can't dedicate this much time between all the things I'm doing, right? And so if there is a level of compensation that can be given to that person, that's going to change the way he approaches it. To say, actually, I would love to explore this creative endeavor, or I would love to explore this project, either partnering with someone like us or just independently or whatever. because he knows that there's going to be a payout. And these things are important.
I think you mentioned about payout. I think it's also very important that for a medium to be viable economically, and when you go into a particular brand, suppose for sponsorship and all of that, they will want to see how you're doing in this particular spectrum. And I think one of the
Yeah.
biggest problems that I feel about podcasts is that the lack of data, and also in terms of how transient are all the different platforms.
Yeah.
So what do you have to say about that? Is there any way that you see in the coming future that it could become more organized in the way that it's easier to really come up with real figures and real data? That is how your podcast is doing. Maybe also gives you some insight as to how you should, maybe program your next episode better.
There is, I think, already some work happening in this space now, right? So we're already starting to see there's a couple of different layers, but I'll give you one example. Is like we have a lot of aggregate platforms now. So platforms that sit on top of the different hosts, collect data from the different hosts, and give you like a consolidated picture of your listenership and your trends and your charts and things like that, right? So Chartable is a good example of something like this, and they're doing really well. They've just raised some more money now, and so people are seeing value in it. They've just launched a membership plan and everything. So I think we're starting to see this maturity starting to kick in now. I mean, the podcasting has been around in the US for over a decade, and now it's like, as you mentioned, in the last 5 years, we've seen a real takeoff. So people are seeing that there is, the ad industry of podcasts is set to cross 1 billion this year. So there's definitely a lot of people looking at the space and saying, okay, how can I step into the space? Is there something I can do that's missing, and so on. So these are actually the areas where a lot of people are looking at. You look at something like the IAB, which is the advertising bureau that has been, that looks at digital advertising, and they're starting to set guidelines, or they have actually set guidelines, and we're actually at version 2 now of how podcasts should be measured and sort of create a consistency, right? Because different hosts do different things to measure data. So now they're trying to standardize that to say, when I say I have one download, what does that download mean? And is it the same across the board? So we're starting to see this organization kind of fall into place anyway. The advantage of being a digital medium means that even if this organization happens in the US, we can leverage it, right? So we can work with a provider that's based somewhere else that is regulated in this manner, or has complied with this standards. So we can also get organized pretty quickly. We don't have to wait for a local provider to show up. So I think that's starting to happen anyway. One of the things, I mean, we didn't really touch on this so much, but podcasting as a medium is very different from your traditional new age mediums that we've seen in the recent past, right? So you look at something like Twitter or Instagram and so on, or even YouTube, right? So you want a video, you go to YouTube. It's very simple, single platform, owned by one company, end of story. So there, all the data is consolidated, right? Podcast is actually extremely decentralized, very similar to what blogging was. And you see, I mean, blogging kind of fell by the wayside eventually because of these social platforms. But the point is that, me as someone, I can pick any hosting provider to host my show. You as a listener can pick any app to listen to your show across any different platform. There are different, charting providers. There are different advertising providers. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility in the medium, but also means everything is decentralized, right? So we have to still figure out ways in which we can consolidate that. Some work is happening already. Some of it is on us, right? So I mean, we talked about the report at the start of this, right? The reason we did the report is we said, okay, let's look at seeing, can we provide some level of consolidated picture based on our own insights across our shows and insights we can get from outside. At least it gives us a baseline, even if it doesn't give us final numbers. And so I think these are the kind of activities that we'll keep doing, of course, and I know other providers will step in to help us standardize and organize a lot of this stuff. That I believe that in a couple of years' time, when you go to an advertiser and you say, I have X downloads and this is what it is, a lot of this stuff will be standardized.
Sure. So finally, I think what I feel, I mean, in terms of when I look at broadcast TV, I have seen that there are already discussion now that live TV, live streaming, or OTT platform is soon going to redefine the definition of broadcast TV. Do you think that's going to same happen to radio as well? Do you think that podcast is going to redefine the very definition of radio broadcasting?
I don't think it's as black and white as it is for TV. Only because you already see, for example, a lot of the radio providers are already offering up their content in podcast format, right? So you're not actually tied to the fact that you missed a show at a certain time. You can jump in, pick up it in the podcast player. I mean, you look at, for example, Dubai Eye here locally. All of their shows are available in podcast players now, right? So I think that because the adoption is a lot easier, Again, it's very different from if you compare like cable to streaming, and you think about all the rights and all that. It's much more complicated. So I think it's a lot easier for this kind of blend to happen, if radio versus podcasting. But I think what you will see, if you would create a parallel, is in the quality and the kind of content that'll come out. So, for example, when you see in today what Netflix is able to put down as money against creating a show, or what Apple is doing now, and Amazon and so on, it's creating shows that traditionally would never have aired on TV. Right. I mean, this is, again, you look at the HBO model, right? Like, HBO creates essentially mini movies, right? And you're starting to see the quality of TV going up and up and up, because streaming providers can spend a lot more, can pull the biggest talents. I mean, we didn't used to see big movie stars show up on TV much until streaming started, right? And then you had things like House of Cards, and you had someone, you have big stars starting to show up in streaming projects and so on and so forth. So I think you'll start to see that kind of parallel is going to happen here as well, right? Because once you decouple the medium from, the broadcaster, right? So you have this whole spate of independent talent, people who have ideas and shows and stuff, who do not have to wait for someone to green light their idea, and can just pick up mics and start producing shows. You'll start to see, I think, and we're already seeing that, right? We're seeing, when you look at things like Serial and stuff, you do wonder, right? Like, is it possible for something like that to have existed? I mean, forget stream. Look at us. I think all of the shows we do, if I had to wait until I could get on the radio, like up today, I would not be producing 15 shows, right? I would be maybe at one at best, right? So I think that advantage does exist. There is a consumer space for it, and it allows us to experiment and play with it, and we're not tied to those traditional formats to be like, okay, well, if I don't pull in an advertiser today, I have to take my show down. We have a lot more flexibility to say, no, let's experiment, let's see what works, and so on and so forth. So I think those kind of parallels will exist, but like I said, I don't think it's going to be as black and white, because you're starting to see already a blend between radio and podcasting. I mean, most people think it's the same thing, in fact. So I mean, there's a difference, of course, in on-demand versus something that's broadcasted, but from a listening point of view, it's like, oh, I can listen to that radio show in a podcast player tomorrow.
And I think also, the unique quality of podcast, as you mentioned rightly, is because it is, not in those shackles of big broadcasters. There's an option of having more experimentation, and with having more experimentation, we definitely see better content, and we can suddenly see a new kind of listeners joining into the medium as well. I think that is something which would definitely happen if podcast remains independent, I think.
Yeah. So there's two sides to that, right? You're talking about the broadcaster side, but I'm also talking from the platform side, right? Today, the medium is not owned by one, a majority of the medium. Like, I mean, YouTube owns 99.9% of the video space. Instagram owns a significant majority of the photo space, right? This is something that doesn't exist today. And even if, for example, I mean, you're looking at people like Spotify, for example, kind of coming in and taking away listeners. Yes, if they grab 90% of the listeners, although I don't know if they'll get there, but if they grab 90% of the listeners, yeah, they may decide on certain things that will force us to do things a certain way. But to this day, I am not, if I don't agree with something Spotify does, I'm not saying I don't, but let's say, for example, that happens, I can just not list on Spotify, right? People can still pick up my show in Apple Podcasts and in Deezer and in Angami and 20 other apps. And so there's an advantage of that thing not being tied down to one platform. And I think podcast is at a unique advantage there, where one provider can't come in, put down some rules, because that always tends to be negative towards the creator, because then they start limiting, let's say, for whatever. So there is a lot of flexibility, and I think that's one of the, as you mentioned, one of the unique aspects of creating shows in the podcast space, which I'm very grateful for. It comes with the downside of the fact that where it's a little disorganized and we don't have all the data in place, and we're still trying to figure out what is the right way to do it. But if you see a lot of the conversations around decentralization and consolidation of data, everybody's having the same conversation. It's like, we want to do it, but we don't want to do it in the way where it becomes everything down to one provider again. We want to do it in a way where we still maintain this independence, we maintain this decentralization, and yet have the ability to put consolidated data together. And I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. I think we really had a very insightful discussion on podcast.
I'm glad you think so.
I'm going to take some of them into my next research paper, and I'm hoping that this discussion also helps everybody who wants to get into podcasting. And I think
I would hope so. I think we need that
after the show. I think some people will definitely get in touch with you after
Absolutely.
after this
Yeah,
show.
yeah. No, definitely. Better on social. I think I'll respond faster. My email inbox tends to be a bit burdened, but yes, absolutely. I mean, I'd love to talk to people who are looking at the space and see how we can help them.
Thank you so much, Chirag, for joining me here today.
No, no, thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.
With that, we've come to an end to the sixth episode of hashtag Remediate with Sabir. Thank you all for connecting with this show live. We are coming live on YouTube and on my personal Facebook account. If you're watching this recorded show, thank you all for your support. Please do like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll keep you posted on what's coming next. Until next time.